I woke up on my birthday to the usual quiet of my Manhattan apartment, the city sounds filtering softly through the windows. Normally, I would have expected a call or text from Nathan or Kara, a small acknowledgement of the day, but there was nothing. No messages, no reminders, not even a belated greeting. I felt the familiar twinge of hurt settle in my chest, an ache I had learned to mask over the years. It wasn't the first time. Over the past decade, my birthday had become a subtle measure of my family's attention and regard. Each year, I had quietly provided support for Nathan and Kara, covering expenses they should have managed themselves: tuition, home renovations, vacations, and countless small emergencies. I had done it without complaint, believing that love was expressed through action rather than expectation. And yet, on this day, all of that effort felt invisible. I recalled the countless Sunday drives to Westchester, rehearsing stories to tell Olivia and Ethan, hoping to catch their attention for more than a fleeting glance at their screens. I remembered paying for school fees, co-signing credit cards, and quietly covering any shortfall without asking for acknowledgement. I had been the silent backbone of their comfort. The guarantor of a lifestyle they had come to assume was theirs by right. Sitting on the edge of my bed, I let the disappointment wash over me fully this time. There was no sugarcoating it. I had been undervalued, overlooked, and treated as an accessory to their convenience rather than the mother who had sacrificed for them. The pattern of neglect had reached a point where inaction no longer felt like an option. I picked up my phone, staring at the blank screen, considering the first step I could take to assert my presence and demand recognition, not with anger, but with deliberate, calculated action that would set the tone for what was to come. Chapter 2. A Lifetime of Giving. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the unopened birthday card from my neighbor and the flowers delivered from a friend, and felt the familiar ache of disappointment settle in my chest. Nathan and Kara hadn't even sent a text, let alone called. It wasn't the first time. Over the years, this had become a pattern I was too polite or perhaps too accustomed to notice. Every holiday, every milestone, every small request had been mine to fulfill, and somehow, my presence had been reduced to a convenience. My generosity assumed rather than appreciated. I remembered the early years after Richard passed. I had taken it upon myself to ensure Nathan and Kara never lacked for anything: tuition payments for their children, a down payment on their dream house in Westchester, renovations, and gifts that I thought would make them happy. I had even co-signed on their credit cards when emergencies arose, believing that love was measured in actions, not words. But each favor, each check written without hesitation, had quietly built a sense of entitlement in them. I replayed countless Sunday dinners in my mind, where I had driven 47 minutes to their home, rehearsing stories to share with Olivia and Ethan, hoping to catch a glimpse of attention in their screen-focused eyes. Nathan's laughter once greeted me at the door, and Kara had once inquired about my week. That warmth had faded, replaced by casual indifference. I had convinced myself they were simply busy, that life demanded their attention elsewhere, that love required patience. But sitting there now, on my birthday morning, the silence from Nathan and Kara was deafening. For the first time in years, I noticed how much of myself I had poured into a family that barely acknowledged my existence. The quiet gnawed at me, sharpening a resolve I hadn't felt in decades. It was time to consider a different kind of action, one that demanded respect rather than blind obedience. As I folded the card back into its envelope, I reached for my phone, already formulating the steps I would take next. The ping of my phone broke the quiet morning. I picked it up, expecting a casual message from a friend or perhaps a delayed birthday wish from a neighbor. Instead, It was Kara. Her words hit like a blow. "We need space. Please don't contact us." I read it twice, hoping the meaning would soften on the second pass, but it didn't. The silence that had stretched across birthdays, holidays, and family events was now formalized in text. A wave of hurt washed over me, but it quickly hardened into something sharper. Anger. Yes, but also clarity. For decades, I had given, sacrificed, and managed every aspect of their comfort. I had smoothed over their mistakes, paid for their indulgences, and treated every request as my duty. And yet, here it was, the ultimate dismissal. My presence, my love, my care reduced to an annoyance they wanted to avoid entirely. Guilt flickered for a moment. The old instinct to forgive and excuse whispering that perhaps I had been too strict in my expectations, too eager to measure love by respect. But that voice was drowned out by a louder, steadier one: justice. Respect could not be demanded quietly anymore. Generosity without acknowledgement had become exploitation. I stared at the screen, imagining all the ways I could respond, not with anger, but with measured consequence. The decision crystallized in my mind. The first step in reclaiming control of my life, my finances, and my dignity. I set the phone down and began drafting the plan that would change the way they regarded me forever. Preparing for the confrontation that would follow, I called James Richardson, our family attorney, first thing that morning. I needed a clear picture of exactly how much support I had provided over the past 5 years. James hesitated, his voice careful, but I insisted. A few days later, I sat in his office, staring at the spreadsheets and statements that laid bare the full scope of my generosity. In total, I had given Nathan and Kara over $800,000. Down payments, renovations, tuition, credit card bills, vacations, it all added up. The trust fund Richard had set up was meant to supplement their income temporarily, not replace it entirely. Yet Nathan had drifted from job to job, barely keeping a foothold, while Kara had never worked consistently, relying on my payments to sustain their lifestyle. What shocked me most was the pattern of mismanagement. Multiple credit card accounts, a second mortgage on the Westchester house, and purchases far beyond what a responsible household could afford. It was systematic, and the realization that I had been supporting more than just their basic needs, the indulgences, the luxuries, the convenience hit me like a cold wave. For years, I had excused small discrepancies, overlooking the warning signs in the name of love. But now, with the numbers in front of me, the truth was undeniable. My generosity had been exploited, my trust manipulated, and my boundaries completely ignored. I left James's office with a heavy heart, but a determined mind, knowing that the next step would not be easy, yet necessary to reclaim control and demand the respect that had long been denied. I returned home that evening, with the weight of the numbers pressing on me. For years, I had been the silent enabler, the bank behind a life that was only theirs to build. Tonight, that ended. I logged into the trust account and carefully revoked Nathan and Kara's access, shutting down the automatic transfers that had funded their comfort for far too long. The decision was deliberate, steady, and final. No sooner had I pressed confirm than my phone erupted. Calls, texts, messages, dozens at once. I watched as notifications stacked higher and higher. Nathan's name flashed repeatedly, each call more desperate than the last. Kara's texts arrived in rapid succession, pleading, demanding, cajoling, and, at times, laced with thinly veiled threats. They didn't say thank you or express concern for my well-being. Their panic was entirely focused on the sudden loss of the funds they had come to rely on. For the first time in decades, I did not flinch. I let the phone ring. I ignored the buzzing. I tasted a freedom that I hadn't felt since Richard was alive. A quiet empowerment that came not from anger, but from clarity. This was not revenge. It was justice. I had spent a lifetime bending to the expectations of others, excusing entitlement as love. And now I was finally bending the situation to reclaim my dignity. Hours passed. And still the calls came. I took a slow breath, sipped my tea, and observed the flurry of panic from a distance. It was uncomfortable, yes, but it was necessary. They were finally experiencing the consequences of their behavior. The abrupt collision between entitlement and accountability. I began drafting a plan. A measured strategy that would ensure they understood the boundaries that had long been ignored. It wasn't about punishment. It was about respect, recognition, and the enforcement of rules that should have existed from the start. With the night settling around me, I knew the coming days would test their desperation and my resolve, and that the real challenge making them confront the truth was only beginning. The next morning, I found a large bouquet of white roses at my door, accompanied by a card in Nathan's handwriting. Thinking of you always. Love, Nathan and Kara. It read. My first instinct was to feel some warmth, but the edges of the words felt rehearsed, too polished, too calculated. Later, a series of calls followed. Nathan's voice was unusually soft, sugary almost, checking in on my health and asking mundane questions, while Kara added a flurry of texts thanking me for everything I had done over the years. Over the following days, the gestures continued: small gifts, carefully worded letters from the grandchildren, even a sudden suggestion to meet for lunch. Everything was timed to perfection, delivered with just enough charm to test my patience, my skepticism, and my resolve. I felt the tug of old habits, the voice that whispered, "Perhaps they've finally recognized the mistake," but I listened to it only long enough to note its presence before dismissing it entirely. It didn't take long to notice the inconsistencies. Olivia's calls were overly formal, almost reading from a script. Ethan's letters contained phrases he would never have used naturally. Nathan's apologies carried the tone of someone who had rehearsed too many lines in front of a mirror. Kara's gratitude seemed designed more to manipulate me than express genuine remorse. I recognized the choreography behind every interaction. The deliberate measures to coax me into reopening the financial faucet they had relied on for years. I let them perform, observing quietly. The flowers sat on my dining table, the letters unopened until I chose to read them. The calls went to voicemail. Every gesture of faux affection was a test, and I refused to participate in their theater. The tension in the apartment became a sort of quiet amusement for me. For the first time in decades, I felt in control of the pace, the narrative, and the power they assumed they still held. I began cataloging their actions, making mental notes of timing, inconsistencies, and the small telltale signs of manipulation. Each gesture only reinforced my resolve. They thought they could return to the status quo with charm and performance. But I was no longer the same mother, the same enabler. The next confrontation would not be guided by words or flowers. It would be guided by truth, evidence, and firm boundaries. I closed the door on another call and prepared for the meeting that would finally force them to face the consequences. I arranged to meet Nathan and Kara at their Westchester home that afternoon. The roses still sat on my table at home, unopened, a reminder of their performance. When I arrived, Nathan greeted me with a tentative smile, and Kara's eyes were wide, her posture stiff, as if she were bracing for a lecture. I stepped inside calmly, closing the door behind me, letting the weight of the moment settle between us. I've reviewed everything, I began, pulling a folder from my bag. The trust fund, the personal contributions, the credit card statements. Over 5 years, I've given more than $800,000 in direct support, and that doesn't even include the gifts, vacations, or incidental expenses. I laid the documents on the table. Nathan and Kara leaned forward, their expressions tightening as the numbers registered. I understand that you've relied on my generosity for a long time. I continued. But the pattern here is not sustainable. It's exploitative. I've tolerated late bills, poor communication, and a lack of consideration. But that ends today. I paused, letting the gravity sink in. From this point forward, there are rules. Financial support will no longer be automatic. I expect accountability, respect, and transparency. You will demonstrate that you value me as a person, not just a provider. Nathan's shoulders slumped slightly, a mix of guilt and disbelief. Kara opened her mouth to protest, but I held up my hand. This isn't about punishment. It's about boundaries and restoring balance. Every action going forward will be measured, and every request will require justification. The tension was palpable. I could see the realization in their eyes that the comfortable life they had assumed was no longer guaranteed. They were being forced to confront the consequences of their choices, the first true test of accountability in years. I closed the folder, standing tall. You have 30 days to show that you can respect these boundaries and rebuild trust, not through staged apologies or gifts, but through genuine effort and acknowledgement. If you fail, the support is permanently restructured, and the consequences will be irreversible. I turned toward the door. Signaling the end of the meeting, Nathan and Kara exchanged a glance, the first hint of calculation fading into the uncertainty of reality. I stepped outside, knowing the next weeks would test not only them, but the strength of the changes I had demanded. Over the following weeks, I observed the slow, uneven adjustments in our family dynamic. Nathan had begun applying himself at a local marketing firm, taking on projects and managing a modest workload. It wasn't the high-flying career he had once imagined, but it was honest work. And for the first time, he had to account for every dollar he earned. He called me occasionally to discuss challenges and decisions, no longer relying on the assumption that I would immediately provide a solution. Kara, meanwhile, had reluctantly enrolled in a continuing education program to update her skills and began attending therapy sessions to confront patterns of overspending and entitlement. The initial defensiveness faded slowly, replaced by tentative acknowledgement of her part in the past imbalance. She even started preparing simple meals for the family, learning small ways to contribute without financial reliance. The grandchildren, Olivia and Ethan, started to show the first signs of authentic engagement. Olivia would ask about my day unprompted, and Ethan shared stories from school without coaching. Our Sunday visits shifted from obligatory gatherings to something resembling meaningful connection. Laughter returned, though cautiously, and I could see that the bonds we had nearly lost were beginning to rebuild themselves, brick by brick. The atmosphere remained fragile, each step forward shadowed by the memory of past manipulation. I stayed vigilant, observing their sincerity, making sure that each gesture matched the accountability I had demanded. There were still tense moments, arguments over minor responsibilities, miscommunications, and occasional slips, but the pattern of entitlement was slowly being replaced by recognition of responsibility. I felt a cautious hope stirring, knowing that change required time and consistent effort. For the first time in years, I sensed a future in which respect, honesty, and effort could coexist with love. I returned home one evening after a weekend visit, reflecting on the progress made and preparing for the next challenge, ensuring that this rebuilding would last, and that the lessons we had all learned would not be forgotten. Sitting in my apartment that evening, I allowed myself a moment to breathe and reflect on how far we had come. For decades, I had measured love through giving, through sacrifice, and through silent endurance. I had allowed my generosity to be assumed, my presence taken for granted. But in reclaiming control, I realized that respect could not be bought or coerced, it had to be earned. The confrontation with Nathan and Kara had been difficult, but necessary. Setting boundaries, demanding accountability, and insisting on transparency had shifted the balance of power in a way that finally recognized my dignity. I had learned that love is not synonymous with financial obligation, and that kindness without reciprocity can become exploitation. Watching Olivia and Ethan engage genuinely, sharing laughter and conversation without prompting, I felt a quiet satisfaction. The changes in Nathan and Kara were still fragile, but they had begun to understand the consequences of entitlement and deception. The family we had nearly lost was slowly healing, reconstructing itself on a foundation of honesty and effort rather than assumption and convenience. I thought about the future, about the relationships I would continue to nurture, and the principles I would uphold. This empowerment was not about punishment. It was about restoring balance, creating a space where respect and love could coexist naturally. I had been a facilitator for their comfort for too long, but now I had learned to stand firm, to protect my time, my resources, and my emotional energy. In the quiet that followed, I felt a sense of control I hadn't known in years, a calm that came from knowing that my worth was no longer defined by what I provided for others. The path ahead would require vigilance and consistency, but for the first time, I felt prepared to maintain it. I closed the folder of statements and drafts I had compiled, ready to transition from reflection to action as the next chapter of our lives began to unfold. A year had passed since the confrontation that reshaped our family, and the changes were undeniable. Nathan had established a steady career as a sales representative for a regional firm, earning his income without relying on my support. Kara had completed her online courses, enrolled in therapy, and gradually managed her spending habits. The Westchester house was sold, and they moved into a modest home in New Jersey, furnishing it carefully and living within their means. The family dynamic had shifted from dependency and entitlement to accountability and effort. Olivia and Ethan thrived in this new environment, visiting on weekends and holidays, engaging with me genuinely without the constraints of expectation or manipulation. Their laughter was spontaneous, their conversations real, and their connection with me felt earned rather than commanded. I found joy in their growth, knowing that the lessons of respect, responsibility, and honesty were taking root. For my part, I had reclaimed a life of independence. I joined a local book club, took up watercolor painting, and allowed myself to explore personal interests I had neglected for years. I even began dating George, a kind widower I had met at a museum lecture, enjoying companionship without the weight of obligation or control. For the first time in decades, my life felt fully my own, guided by choice rather than duty. The family dinners resumed with a different tone, collaborative, respectful, and engaging. Nathan and Kara now handled their finances responsibly, discussing decisions openly with each other, and my presence was valued as a grandmother and a person rather than a source of funds. The stability we had fought to achieve was fragile yet promising, built on effort, communication, and the hard-earned lessons of the past year. As I watched Olivia and Ethan play a board game beside me, I felt a sense of closure and empowerment. The journey from exploitation to respect had been difficult, but it had led to dignity, authentic connections, and the inheritance of values that mattered far more than money. The foundation we had rebuilt promised a future where love and respect would guide every step.